section, we're going to talk about Alexander the Great. We're going to also talk about this idea of a Hellenistic world. And basically, this is a fancy way of saying the spread of Greek culture out of the confines of continental Greece and into the rest of the world. And in general, this is a military, uh, it happens because the military branches out. The military in war tends to transport knowledge and culture all over the place when it invades somewhere. And you see this over and over again. It happens in France during the Napoleonic Wars. It happens from Germany and Hitler, Russia, Stalin, America, and the kind of communist West. And warfare becomes a vehicle for transporting ideology and culture. Now, the empire that we're going to be talking about here basically spans from Greece to India. And this blend of Greek ideas and Greek culture mixes with all of these different cultures and people that are contained inside this area on the map. But we're going to start by talking about Macedonia, which is indicated by the red arrow on the left-hand side. So 359, Philip II, Philip of Macedon, which Macedonia is this little tiny province that's just north of Greece proper. He is this ruthless military figure. He's extremely powerful warlord, and he attacks Greece itself. And ironically, this ends Greek independence, and he is able to complete the conquest that Persia never could. And part of that is because in the wake of the Persian Wars, there's been all this infighting, and it's left Greece um, susceptible to outside attack. And the Greeks themselves don't perceive the Macedonians as a threat. They look at them as kind of backwards, lower class people. And that's ironic because the Macedonians themselves self identify as Greek. And with the chronic squabbling of all the different city states, they're unable to unite and stop Philip from completing his conquest of Greece. After invading and taking over Greece, Philip of Macedon decides he wants to invade Persia. And kind of from a sense of historical irony, considering that Persia had always been the one to be invading Greece. But he doesn't get to complete this conquest because he's murdered. And his son, Alexander III, this is the Alexander the Great that everyone references, takes over. And Alexander the Great is very young. He's about 20 years old at this time. He's very charismatic, and the army absolutely loves him. And this is because of the way he treats them. He lives with them, he fights with them, he treats them um, with a huge amount of respect, and they just respond to this really well. And in 334, at a place called the Hellespont, and this is kind of a natural area for armies to cross going from Persia into Greece or vice versa, there's a battle in which the Macedonian army kills about 35,000 Persians. And after this, Alexander decides not to just invade Persia, but to carry the total conquest of Persia. And remember that Persia, while it is still a huge empire, is nowhere near as powerful as it was during the Persian Wars with Greece. This is probably the most famous image of Alexander. It is an image well, to mosaic that commemorates the Battle of Issus. And it's made up of all these different colored tiles. And you can see Alexander, he's over there on the left, just above where that arrow is pointing. And he's riding at the head of his army. He's fighting with these troops. He's not some general that sits way behind the lines and just waits for everybody to do everything for him. He's right there in the thick of the fighting. And on the right-hand side, just underneath that other arrow, you can see King Darius of Persia. And Darius is defeated. And he's not just defeated, but humiliated. He's quite literally driven off of the battlefield. And so Alexander begins to portray himself uh, as this great military personality. I mean, he is winning on the battlefield, that's true, but there's great propaganda value in images like this. And you see here Alexander being shown in this very powerful position, very respectful position, and it kind of should bring back to your mind like the images of Narmer, where he's always smiting someone, or being shown taking all of these captives and things like that. This is the same kind of propaganda image for Alexander. Part of what's making the Macedonians so powerful and able to do such damage in battle is that they're using a new type of military technology. Now, they're using a type of phalanx like you saw with the Greeks before, the hoplite phalanx, but this is a more specific type. It's a 16 by 16 square. It's shielded like the other type, but it also has these 18-foot long pikes and spears. And essentially, this thing operates like a human bulldozer, and it's able to break through lines and punch holes in defenses. And once you have penetrated the enemy's defenses, you can send cavalry into the gap, and they can roll up the enemy from the flanks. This breaks the enemy formation, causes confusion, and then allows you to exploit their confusion to your victory. Um, this is kind of an extension of the idea of the hoplite phalanx, but it's taken to a much larger, more powerful um, level. And Alexander is a master at these kind of tactics. He's been trained in military tactics since childhood, and so this is second nature. And you can see how effective this new tactic using the Macedonian phalanx is. In battle after battle after battle, the Macedonians just crush the Persians. So at Issus in 333, 75,000 Persians are killed. Darius, like I just said before, is just driven off the field, manages to regroup, draws a new defensive line at the Granicus River. They fight again. This time, 40,000 Persians are killed. They reorganize again at Gaugamela, and this time, 250,000 Persians are killed. And after this, the Persian Empire simply cannot sustain those kind of losses, and Persia quite literally begins to collapse. So with each one of these major battles, Alexander snatches a huge portion of the Persian Empire away. After Issus, uh, Anatolia, this is that kind of coastal area of Turkey, or what would become Turkey, falls to the Macedonians. After Gaugamela, we're talking about Egypt. So we're dealing with gigantic pieces of the Persian Empire. And after this, Alexander occupies Mesopotamia. He burns Persepolis to the ground. He pays his army with all of this looted treasure from the conquest of Persia. And the army obviously loves this. It's recognition for their hard work, but they actually feel invested in this conflict, and feel as if they're making personal gain out of all this blood and effort that they've put in. Alexander's not entirely satisfied with the conquest and destruction of Persia, and almost immediately he and his army invades India. And India, however, is a much different place. Now, all of the people involved in this are all polytheists, but the nature of the Indian gods seemed strange and bizarre to the Macedonians. Alexander has also traveled far enough physically on the face of the planet that he is encountering totally new battlefield environments, and going from mountain to desert to forest, that kind of thing. And in India, they're fighting in forests, but also flood zones. And even facing all of these new obstacles, he's still just doesn't run across anyone that can really stop him until he reaches the Hydaspes River. And at this time, the river is in overflow because of the yearly monsoon cycle. And the monsoon, of course, is also something entirely new to the Macedonians. At the Hydaspes, Alexander is met by a king, King Porus, and Porus uses the river to his advantage. He sees that the river is in flood stage, and so he decides to kind of wait Alexander out on the hope that Alexander will exhaust his supplies and turn back for Greece or maybe Babylon, something like that. And Alexander uses a feint where he appears to be staying in one place, but actually marches his army out to the east and crosses the river. In addition to the driving torrential rain of the monsoon, King Porus is also counting on his 200 plus or minus war elephants to stop the phalanx. And these elephants are armored. They're very good against horses. They're extremely powerful against lightly armored loose infantry. But elephants can be spooked by direct attack as well. So this map is a plan of the actual battle, and all of the dots that you see to the right of the red bars, those are all of the elephants, and they're out in front of the Indian infantry, and you can also see that the phalanx advances across the field almost in lockstep, like I say, just like a human bulldozer, and drives right into the elephants and then right into the Indian infantry formations. And fighting here is savage. And after an unbelievable amount of bloodshed, Alexander actually manages to prevail one more time on the battlefield. And at this point, Alexander's empire stretches from the Mediterranean, north of Greece, Macedonia, all the way to India, and it includes Egypt and what would be modern day Afghanistan, parts of what would be modern day Afghanistan, and still Alexander wants to continue further to the east with his conquest. And we're talking about an empire that is so large that it's easier for me to show it to you on a picture of the globe from space than it is on a map, a flat 2D map. Now, Alexander may have had the will to continue to the east, but the problem is that his army, is by this time just exhausted. And the fight with Porus and the war elephants has dealt a horrendous number of casualties to the Macedonian army. And even more than just the casualties from that one battle, you have to remember that this army has been in essentially nonstop fighting and combat for 11 years, and they have marched more than 11,000 miles. And this is a time when it's not like everybody just hops onto the Humvees and goes cruising off, or they load onto the troop ship and it carries them someplace. We're talking 11,000 marched miles. It's really a marvel of military engineering. And basically, the army tells Alexander, look, we love you, but this is it. This is as far as we go, and we have to turn back. And so that's exactly what happens. Alexander turns with the army, they go back to the west, and they return to Babylon. And of course, Babylon is a major capital of conquered Persia, and it is also essentially smack dab in the middle of all of the conquests that Alexander has made. It is also where Alexander drops dead in 323 BC. And he hasn't really had any time at all to enjoy, if that's the right word, his conquests. As soon as he gets back to Babylon, essentially, he dies. Now, that leaves his empire, in a tricky position because suddenly this empire, which covers tens of thousands of square miles, suddenly has no ruler. And because they don't have the personality, the individual leadership of Alexander, the generals actually begin to fight amongst themselves as to who should come to rule. And the generals, while they may be popular with their troops, none of them are remotely as charismatic um, or as strong willed as Alexander himself was. And Alexander's empire breaks into pieces. And this takes place over decades, and it's essentially civil war. And eventually you end up with three roughly defined pieces of Alexander's empire. One of them is centered around Macedonia, and it's the Antigonid section of the empire. There's the Ptolemaic section of the empire. This is centered in Egypt and that kind of southern Mediterranean African section. And there's the Seleucid Empire, which is Asia. That's everything out toward the east, where Alexander had finally stopped and turned back. And what is significant about all of this is that as the army had marched, they had founded cities, they had built structures, they had brought examples of their art and culture with them. And so these Greek ideas and culture had spread all along with the Macedonian army. And all of these formerly isolated people have been brought into loose trading networks. There's the exchange of ideas that takes place over this truly gigantic land area. And I can give you a very good example of this diffusion of culture and intellectual, brand new intellectual property. And that is a dramatic increase and expansion of ideas of philosophy this time. So, in this diffusion, a lot of people begin to think um, academically about how people should live their lives and how they should interact with each other and what their place is in the world. And I'm going to give you four examples of how this works, and I'll try and tie them to kind of modern examples you may or may not recognize. But the first one is Stoicism. It's invented by a guy named Zeno, and he argues that human desires are distractions. So the things that people crave, wealth and power, these are very dangerous. And you should focus on what is within your control and accept the things in life and the things that are going on around you in the world as the will of God's, and and accept that natural laws kind of run the universe. So the good example of the Stoicism, I pick Mr. Spock from Star Trek, who's kind of turning his back on emotions and wealth and power as ideas that are dangerous and looking more internally um, for control, that kind of thing. So there's also cynicism, which is by far the most fun, but it's less easy to define. And with cynicism, you're kind of rejecting accepted social transitions, or excuse me, traditions. And happiness can be found in simplicity. And you're cutting through all of the noise and socio-political baggage of life. So my first thought was, if you've seen the movie Fight Club, this is essentially what's going on. This is that movie is a gigantic, cynical look at modern society and what it does to us as participants in it. There's the idea of Epicureanism, started by a guy named Epicurus, and he suggests that gods could care less about us as human beings. And the only things that are real are the things that you can physically experience with your senses. And so, therefore, you should try to achieve the most pleasure by moving toward things, or excuse me, moving away from pain, um, acting virtuous, and moving toward things that are pleasurable. Now, we've kind of warped this in our modern sensibility, and Epicureanism has kind of been turned into this idea of fixation on human pleasures at the cost of all else. And my example here would be Dr. Hannibal Lecter from the movie Silence of the Lambs, and he's quite literally pursuing pleasures in the form of the things that he eats, even though society says you should not be a serial killer and eat each other. But this is just him going along with, he's moving away from, um, he's trying to experience all of these things for his senses, even though um, they're absolutely immoral, and or society says they're immoral and actually quite illegal. Now there's Diogenes of Sinope comes up with this idea of skepticism, and skepticism is essentially the idea that nothing can be known for certain. You cast doubt towards old ideas, and you actually pursue truth through doubt by asking questions and not believing necessarily everything that you hear. So I chose Dr. Dana Scully from the X Files as an example of this. She's brought in to debunk and um, refute all of the excuse me, all of the findings of her partner, Fox Mulder. And everything that he comes up with, all of this evidence for aliens and extraterrestrials and sewer monsters and everything else, she's always the one that has to ask, is this real? Where's the scientific evidence? She's kind of the skeptic in the whole thing. So all four of these concepts remain influential theories of philosophy, and you can see each one illustrated in these examples from mass media, kind of pop culture icons of the 20th century. So this Hellenistic expansion and diffusion really has a long-lasting effect.